Charles III is officially ascending to the British throne to be the new monarch. And for the first time in history, we're able to watch the ceremony at home from start to finish.
King Alaric III did not summon his family often. In 31 years on the throne of Varangian, he had called this particular room into use perhaps a dozen times, and each time, something in the kingdom had shifted afterward. The sovereign's chamber sat at the quiet heart of Buckingham Palace, windowless, soundproofed, reserved for the kind of decisions that could not survive being overheard. On a gray October morning, 5 people received the same message within the same hour: come to the sovereign's chamber at noon. No reason given, no agenda attached. Crown Prince Edmund read the note twice, searching for a clue that wasn't there. His wife, Princess Rosalind, felt her stomach tighten before she even understood why. Queen Consort Isel, married to Alaric for 11 years, read the note standing in her private study and set it down slowly, as though it might still change if she looked away and looked back. Princess Maren, the king's sister, simply sighed. She had seen this particular kind of silence before, and she knew what it usually meant. By the time all 5 had taken their seats around the long oak table, the room had the stillness of a held breath. King Alaric arrived last, carrying a single folder bound in deep crimson leather. He did not sit at the head of the table as he usually did. He stood. "I won't waste your time with a preamble," he said. "There will be a coronation. Edmund's coronation. The 14th of March. Nobody moved. 5 months away. Not a distant, comfortable future date, an actual point on the calendar. Close enough to touch." Edmund was the first to speak. Why now? It was a fair question, and everyone in the room knew it deserved a fair answer. Alaric was 62, in reasonable health, with no illness forcing his hand and no scandal pressing at the gates. He could have reigned another decade without anyone questioning it. Instead, he was choosing, deliberately and years ahead of expectation, to hand over the one thing he had spent his entire adult life protecting. Alaric didn't answer right away. He opened the crimson folder instead and began reading from a formal document. The coronation would take place at the Basilica of St. Ostia. The full ceremonial structure, music, procession, seating. The symbolic elements that would define how the kingdom understood its new king would be designed and overseen not by the royal household's usual protocol office and not by Edmund himself, but by Rosalind. The room's temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. Isel's spine straightened. She had spent over a decade at Alaric's side, weathering a public that had taken years to accept her, learning every unwritten rule of a court that did not easily forgive outsiders. She had assumed, reasonably, that a moment this significant would include her in some meaningful way. Instead, she was hearing about it at the same time as everyone else, and hearing that the role had gone to Rosalind. "I have thoughts," Isel said carefully, "about how the transition should be handled." "I'm sure you do," Alaric said. "We'll discuss them." "Not today." He closed the folder before she could say another word. Princess Maren, sitting slightly apart from the others, watched Isel's jaw tighten and thought, "This isn't finished, not even close." Edmund finally placed his hand on the folder, but didn't open it. Rosalind reached over and rested 2 fingers lightly on his wrist, not a public gesture, not performed for anyone, just something private between them. Alaric watched the 2 of them with an expression that didn't fit easily into one word. Pride, certainly, but something heavier sat underneath it. It was Maren who noticed the second envelope. It had been placed beneath Alaric's chair, half hidden, easy to miss, unless you were looking for exactly this kind of thing, and Maren had spent 40 years learning to look for exactly this kind of thing. Edmund's name was written across the front in their father's hand, below it to be read alone. The date had been announced, but whatever had actually caused it, whatever justified moving a coronation 5 years ahead of the expected timeline, was still sealed, and their father hadn't been ready to say it out loud in front of the people who loved him most. Edmund didn't open the envelope in the palace. He carried it back to his own residence, set it on the desk in his study, and looked at it for the better part of an hour before Rosalind came to find him. "You don't have to read it tonight," she said. "I know. But you're going to." He nodded. He'd spent years preparing for the throne in the abstract briefings, ceremonies, long afternoons, with constitutional advisors explaining the mechanics of a job that had always existed somewhere ahead of him, safely in the future. The announced date had collapsed that distance. The future was no longer a direction. It was a fixed point, 5 months out, and he was already walking toward it whether he felt ready or not. Rosalind sat across from him, not pushing, just present. Eventually, she said what she'd been carrying since the meeting. Our children are going to feel whatever you feel about this. Before they understand a word of what it means, they'll know if you're afraid. They're 2 children young enough still to think of the palace as simply home, not yet old enough to grasp what it would eventually demand of them had no framework for a father becoming king. But they had every framework for reading his face. Edmund broke the seal. Inside, a single handwritten line, everything changed after Draymore. He sat with it for a long moment, because he understood immediately that this sentence was not really an answer. It was a door to a room he hadn't known existed. 3 months before the Crimson Folder, Alaric had staged what the palace quietly called a continuity exercise at Draymore Castle, the family's private estate in the Northern Hills. The premise, at least officially, was simple. Run a rehearsal for how the senior family would manage a sudden crisis the king incapacitated without warning. Decisions needing to be made in real time, no room for improvisation once the actual event occurred. Edmund believed it was exactly that. Rosalind suspected it was something more, not just a test of procedure, but a test of the people. Who kept their composure? Who reached for authority they didn't yet have a right to? Who stayed quiet when speaking up would have mattered? The scenario unfolded over an afternoon. A fictional emergency, canceled state appearances, urgent papers needing a signature no one in the room was legally authorized to give. Then a senior equerry, playing his assigned part a little too well, asked the question the whole exercise had been built around. If the king could not act, who would? Isel answered before Edmund could. She said, plainly, that no transition of authority should happen without her involvement and approval. It wasn't in the script. Alaric, watching from the side of the room, said nothing, but something in his expression changed, not anger, something closer to quiet alarm. He had planned for hesitation. He had not planned for a claim. Edmund stayed silent, out of respect for his father's marriage and a genuine uncertainty about what the moment called for. Rosalind, watching him not answer, understood something Edmund himself hadn't yet worked out. Silence, at a moment like that, doesn't read as respect. It reads as a vacuum. And vacuums get filled by whoever moves fastest. Afterward, in a side room at Draymore, Alaric asked his son directly why he hadn't spoken up. Edmund said he wouldn't contest Isel for authority while his father was still standing in front of him, alive and reigning. It was a loyal answer. It was also, Rosalind told Alaric later, a dangerous one, because leaving the line of succession's practical authority undefined wasn't kindness. It was an invitation for exactly the kind of quiet rivalry that could fracture a family once the real crisis, whenever it came, actually arrived. That night, alone in his study at Draymore, Alaric removed the signet ring he wore on his right hand and set it on the desk in front of him, looking at it for a long time. Then he called his private secretary and dictated the outline of a fixed coronation timeline, 5 months, not 5 years. In the same conversation, he instructed that Rosalind be given authority over the ceremonial design. Draymore hadn't just tested the family. It had shown Alaric, with uncomfortable clarity, exactly what would happen if he waited too long to make his intentions clear. Isel heard the full story of Draymore secondhand, through a member of the household who hadn't realized how much she didn't yet know. When she understood that the exercise and her own unscripted claim during it had directly shaped the coronation date, she requested a private meeting with Rosalind. No advisors, no secretaries, just the 2 of them. She chose to hold it at her own residence, Larkwell House, her ground, her terms. She expected Rosalind to arrive with papers, perhaps a household advisor trailing behind her. Instead, Rosalind came alone, empty-handed. It was a small detail, but it said something Isel understood immediately. Rosalind hadn't come to negotiate procedurally. She'd come to speak plainly, queen to queen, without anything standing between them. Isel opened first. She argued that the new ceremonial structure, stripped of several traditions that had marked every coronation for 2 centuries, was quietly erasing the dignity of Alaric's own reign before it had even properly ended. Every tradition removed, she said, was a small insult to the king, who was still, at that moment, very much on the throne. Rosalind didn't retreat. She said that preparing Edmund properly wasn't an attack on Alaric. It was protection against exactly the kind of confusion Dremore had exposed, the confusion that happens when nobody knows, with certainty, who holds authority in a crisis. Iselle pushed further. She talked about what it had cost her to stand beside Alaric for over a decade, the public skepticism she'd had to outlast, the years spent being treated as an outsider before the country grudgingly accepted her place. She said that endurance like that earned her a voice in what came next. Rosalind listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said the thing that changed the shape of the conversation: survival could not become the organizing principle of an institution meant to outlast every person who served it. Iselle made 2 requests, direct and specific: prominent seating for her extended family at the coronation, and a formal ceremonial role in the service itself. Rosalind refused both, without cruelty, but without hesitation either. She explained that the ceremony was built around one idea: the lawful, orderly transfer of the crown from Alaric to Edmund, not around distributing recognition to people based on loyalty or tenure. Then she showed Iselle something she hadn't expected: a signed instruction from Alaric himself, dated the night of Dremore, authorizing the exact structural changes Iselle had been objecting to. It wasn't Rosalind's ambition on display. It was the king's own decision, in his own hand, with his own signature. Iselle sat with that for a long moment. Then she asked, quietly, whether Rosalind intended to start acting like a queen before she'd actually become one. Rosalind stood to leave. At the door, she turned back and answered in 8 words, "No. I intend to be ready when I am." Within the hour, Iselle was at the palace, asking Alaric to reverse the decision. He listened to Iselle's argument that Rosalind's growing authority made the current reign look as though it were being dismantled before it had ended. That Iselle herself increasingly felt like a guest in a household she'd spent 11 years building a life inside. He didn't dismiss what she felt. He told her plainly that he understood it, and that he wasn't going to pretend her feelings didn't matter. But he also told her the throne could not be governed by reassurance alone. Somewhere, a line had to be drawn, or every future decision would be renegotiated by whoever pushed hardest. Marin found him afterward, sitting beside an unsigned transition order, and told him something he needed to hear from someone who wasn't his wife or his son. Every day the order went unsigned, she said, was another day for competing loyalties to organize themselves around Edmund advisors. Relatives, court factions, all of them reading the ambiguity as an opening. The order existed specifically to prevent that. Leaving it vague wouldn't protect anyone. It would guarantee exactly the chaos it was meant to stop. Alaric signed it that night. The document specified, in plain terms, that Rosalind's ceremonial decisions could only be overruled by Edmund or by Alaric himself, not by Iselle, not by advisors, not by any relative claiming informal authority. When Iselle read the first paragraph, she closed the folder without a word and left the room. Alaric let her go. He understood, better than anyone, exactly what that silence cost her. From that point, the machinery of transition began moving in small, visible ways. Meetings once run by Alaric started appearing on Edmund's schedule instead. Staff who had served one king for decades quietly began preparing for another. For Alaric, each transferred responsibility felt like watching a piece of his own identity get reassigned. For Edmund, each new duty arrived carrying the unmistakable weight of his father's approaching departure, and he noticed, with some discomfort, that palace staff had started treating Alaric as though he were already gone. He corrected that every time he saw it. Alaric remained the reigning king until the actual day of the coronation, and Edmund made sure nobody forgot it, not through grand gestures, but through small, deliberate ones. When he arrived at a routine briefing to find his father's usual chair quietly shifted aside, while his own had been placed at the head of the table, Edmund didn't say anything about it publicly. He simply moved the chairs back before the meeting started and sat beside his father instead of across from him. "I'm not going to start this by pushing you out of the room," he said. Alaric sat down next to him. For that one meeting, at least, the crown didn't stand between them. That evening, Alaric asked Edmund to meet him alone at Dremore. No Rosalind, no Isel, no advisors waiting outside. He chose the same small study where the two of them had sat together on the night Edmund's mother had died, years earlier. The choice of room wasn't accidental, and Edmund understood that the moment he walked in. He expected instructions. His father gave him honesty instead. Alaric admitted he'd spent months worried about waiting too long about what he'd watched happen at Dremore. The way uncertainty had almost immediately produced competing claims to authority that had no business existing. He told Edmund he'd made a decision that night. He would not let hesitation become the inheritance he left his son. The March date wasn't arbitrary. It marked quietly the anniversary of a promise Alaric had made to Edmund years earlier. In a conversation no one else had witnessed, that when the crown finally came, Edmund would not be left to face it unprepared. Naming the date now, while Alaric was healthy and fully in control of the decision, was his way of keeping that promise on his own terms, before illness or crisis or anyone else's ambition could take the choice away from him. Then Edmund said what he'd been carrying since the crimson folder first opened. Becoming king didn't frighten him nearly as much as the possibility that the weight of it would put distance between him and Rosalind, between him and their children. Duty had already claimed pieces of their private life together. He didn't think he could survive a reign that asked for what little remained. Alaric understood that fear better than his son knew. He told Edmund that Rosalind had been placed at the center of the coronation for exactly that reason, not as a decorative honor, but because she understood royal tradition without being trapped by it, and because her role, properly understood, wasn't about ceremony at all. It was about protecting the people entering this next chapter from being consumed by the institution surrounding them. He reached into his coat and produced a small